Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really important, maybe even frightening story. It's from the book When Money Destroys Nations. It details the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, how people survived, and crucially, warnings for other nations. The authors are Philip Haslam and Russell Lamberti.
And it's more than just history. The book really lays out a blueprint for economic and social collapse. It covers Zimbabwe from about 2000 to 2009.
Right. The core mission here isn't just to recount what happened in Zimbabwe, though that's harrowing enough. It's to see it as a universal warning.
Exactly. The geography is Africa, but the lessons about government debt, about printing money, they apply everywhere. It's a really visceral warning.
And what struck me is how the authors tie this directly back to the American founders, reminding us they went through their own currency collapse.
The Continental dollar, yeah. Printed until it was literally worthless. That's where we get the phrase, not worth a continental.
And that experience wasn't just forgotten, was it? It fundamentally shaped how they thought about government and money.
Absolutely. It led directly to that safeguard in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts.
Which wasn't just some minor economic point. They saw it as crucial moral architecture.
Precisely. Designed specifically to stop the government from doing exactly what happened in Zimbabwe, secretly stealing people's wealth, their liberty, just by debasing the currency.
Okay, before we get into the sequence of events, this step-by-step destruction, we need to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this thing. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It really is. When we talk hyperinflation here, we're not talking 10, 20% a year. The peak annual inflation rate, get this, in November 2008 was 89.7 sextillion %.
Sextillion. Let's just say the number.
It's 89 followed by 21 zeros. 89,700 billion %.
Breaks your brain trying to imagine that.
It does. The classic example is usually Weimar, Germany, 1922-23. Their peak daily rate was about 98%. Zimbabwe just blew past that. Prices were doubling, literally, sometimes within an hour.
Wow. And something like that doesn't just happen overnight. It's the end result of choices made over years.
Calculated political choices. That's the key.
So let's go back. Phase 1, the storm gathers. To really feel the impact of the collapse, we need to understand what Zimbabwe was before. In the 80s, it had a reputation.
A strong one. It was known as the breadbasket of Africa, and for good reason.
What did that mean, practically?
It meant vast natural wealth, really fertile land, minerals, diamonds, gold, platinum, nickel, you name it. Plus, and this is important, a well-educated, hardworking population.
And decent infrastructure too, right? Even after sanctions from the UDI period in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, surprisingly sophisticated infrastructure survived. They had a strong commercial farming sector, exporting food, tobacco, other commodities. It was a functioning, relatively prosperous economy.
So a solid foundation. Banks worked, exports flowed, skilled people. How does a place like that start down the path to ruin? The authors point to mismanagement under Mugabe, centralization of power. But the debt spiral really kicks off when?
The key period seems to be 1989 to 1997. And the main catalyst, the big one, was a political decision in 97.
What happened?
The government, under pressure from war veterans, a very powerful political group, approved a massive new monthly pension plan for them, unfunded.
How massive?
The payments were set at about double the average civil servant's salary at the time. Just created out of thin air this huge liability on the government's books.
Wow. Not a small adjustment. That's
Right.
a deliberate, enormous fiscal bomb with no plan to pay for it.
None. And the consequences were immediate. Foreign lenders, the World Bank, they weren't stupid. They saw the sudden, completely unsustainable spending.
They got nervous.
Very nervous. They saw the government was basically buying political loyalty with money it didn't have. The World Bank pulled a $100 million loan facility in 97. The government couldn't explain how they'd pay these pensions, so they effectively defaulted on other international loans and just stopped the economic reforms they'd promised.
And that sets up Black Friday, November 14th, 1997.
That's the day the currency crashed hard, and it was the moment the government really committed to the path of printing money. Large-scale printing began right then to try and cover the gap. Annual inflation immediately jumped to 20%.
And things just got worse from there.
Yeah, it compounded. Foreign aid started drying up because of the defaults and lack of reform. Tax revenues were dwindling. And then in 1998, they got involved in a very costly military adventure in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The government was basically broke.
So they hit a fork in the road. Cut spending drastically, tell the veterans, the army, the civil servants no money, or
Print it. And cutting spending, telling powerful groups they won't get paid, that's political suicide for a regime like Mugabe's.
printing is the quiet way, the silent tax, as the book says.
Exactly. It's politically convenient in the short term. So they chose the path of least resistance. The Reserve Bank started pumping billions of newly printed Zimbabwe dollars into the economy to pay the government's immediate bills. They knew it would cause inflation, but they prioritized immediate political survival over long-term economic health.
But even that wasn't the tipping point into full-blown hyperinflation, was it? The real accelerant was poured on in 2000 with the land seizures.
That was the fatal blow to the real economy, the part that actually produces things. And again, it was purely political.
How so?
Mugabe had just suffered this humiliating defeat in a constitutional referendum, a no vote largely organized by an opposition coalition that included many from the white farming community.
So this was payback.
Swift, violent payback. He unleashed these so-called land reforms, which were really organized, often violent invasions of commercial farms. The main goal wasn't reform. It was to smash his political opponents' networks and reward his loyalists with seized assets.
And the economic impact wasn't just replacing experienced farmers with less experienced ones.
Oh no, it was wholesale destruction. These productive commercial farms were stripped bare, irrigation systems ripped out, tractors stolen, livestock slaughtered or stolen. The land was often handed over to party officials or allies who had zero farming knowledge or interest.
So you wipe out your export base overnight.
Completely. Agriculture, mining exports, gone. That was their main source of foreign currency. So immediately, you get a food crisis domestically, you get mass defaults on farm loans, which shakes the entire banking system, and factories that relied on farm inputs start closing down. Rapid deindustrialization.
So the money printing was destroying the value of the currency, and the land seizures were destroying the ability to create real value. A perfect storm.
Exactly. The destruction of the real economy made the effects of the money printing infinitely worse. There was nothing backing the currency anymore, not even the potential for future production.
Okay, that sets the stage. Now let's shift from the big picture to how this felt on the ground. Phase 2. Hyperinflation as a personal and moral crisis. The authors talk about these gorge moments like points of no return. What was the first big psychological shift?
Gorge moment 1 was when people's expectations flipped. Instead of looking at past inflation to figure out prices or wages, they started basing everything on expected future inflation.
So instead of asking for a 10% raise because prices went up 10% last year?
Right. You started demanding 100%, 500% raise because unit prices would double or triple next week or even tomorrow.
Yeah.
It fundamentally broke the way people thought about value and time.
And that instantly destroys anyone on a fixed income, right? Pensioners, people with contracts.
They were wiped out first. Imagine your pension reviewed once a year based on last year's inflation. It became worthless almost overnight. It just shreds the social contract, the idea that saving money, that thrift, that planning for the future has any meaning. Uncertainty becomes total.
Then gorge moment 2, which sounds completely backwards. Printing insane amounts of money leads to a shortage of physical cash. How does that work?
It's about the speed of the collapse. Prices were rising so incredibly fast, the Reserve Bank literally couldn't design, print, and distribute new banknotes with enough zeros on them quickly enough.
So the price of bread jumps from $1 billion to $5 billion overnight. But there are no $5 billion notes available yet.
Exactly. The ATMs would run dry constantly. Banks couldn't keep up. People would queue for hours, days, just to get cash that was losing value as they stood there.
And the result of that physical shortage?
Bank runs, obviously. But also this bizarre black market where physical cash, the actual paper notes, traded at a huge premium over money in a bank account, sometimes 30% or more.
Why? The paper was losing value too.
Yeah, but people realized money stuck in a failing bank account, digital money, was even more vulnerable than rapidly depreciating paper they could actually hold and maybe spend immediately. It was the lesser of two evils, the government's only response. Print faster, print bigger denominations, which just fueled the fire.
Which leads to gorge moment 3, the death of normal business. How can you run a shop when the money is collapsing?
You can't. It becomes impossible. The core problem was replacement cost. By the time a shopkeeper sold, say, a can of beans, the cost of buying a new can of beans to restock the shelf was already higher than the money they just received.
So you could be selling things all day, look profitable on paper, but actually be going bankrupt with every sale.
Precisely. So what do businesses do? Manufacturing just stopped. The country deindustrialized incredibly quickly. Companies either shut their doors, moved operations out of the country if they could, or they just pivoted entirely to speculation.
Not making things, just trying to protect whatever value they had left.
Right. Hoarding scarce goods, trading foreign currency, buying shares, anything tangible. Actually, serving customers became pointless, even dangerous to the business's survival. Stores just emptied out. By 2006, the authors say, finding basic goods was a daily struggle. Scarcity was everywhere.
We need to pause on that. Chapter 7 talks about the raw human cost. Beyond the economics, what did mass hunger look like?
It's truly harrowing. The book recounts stories of office workers fainting at their desks from hunger, people in rural areas literally eating bark off trees to survive. Basic medicines disappeared.
And the government's response? Price controls.
Yeah, the classic disastrous response. They imposed strict price controls, trying to force businesses to sell goods below their replacement cost, which of course just made the shortages even worse. Shops simply closed down rather than sell at a loss. It also drove everything underground into black markets, where prices were even higher. Food itself became weaponized, used by the ruling party to reward loyalty and punish dissent.
So survival becomes this constant, desperate scramble. And people got incredibly resourceful, doesn't they? The book details this whole ecosystem of alternative survival currencies.
Immensely resourceful. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? One amazing example was the Woodmead macro pallets.
Explain that. Macro is a big warehouse store in South Africa, right?
Yeah. Zimbabweans who could get hold of US dollars or South African rand would drive across the border, buy huge amounts of non-perishable basics. Soap, sugar, cooking oil, canned goods stacked on a standard pallet at Macro in Woodmead. That entire pallet then became a recognized unit of value back in Zimbabwe.
Like a giant physical stablecoin.
Kind of. You could trade fractions of the pallet's contents. It was a physical store of value and a medium of exchange born entirely out of desperation and the need for something stable.
There are darker examples too, like tampon money.
That one really hits you. It shows the utter breakdown. Basic sanitary products became so scarce and essential that they reportedly became a medium of exchange, facilitating trades even within prisons. It highlights how anything durable, essential, and in demand could become money when the official currency failed. Canned goods, bags of grain.
And fuel coupons became a major one.
Huge! Fuel was critical for transport, for generators, because the power grid was collapsing. Certain fuel companies, like Redan Petroleum, were allowed to sell fuel for foreign currency, so they developed a system. You paid them in US dollars, or rand, and you got a coupon guaranteeing you a certain amount of fuel later.
And these coupons started circulating.
Widely. Because they were backed by a real, stable asset fuel, people trusted them more than the Zimbabwe dollar. They became a common, quasi-legal currency for everyday payments. The fuel companies essentially became the new bankers, creating a functioning private monetary system.
Amazing ingenuity. But while people were figuring out how to survive, the basic fabric of society, the infrastructure, was falling apart. Chapter 8 covers this. Government services just stopped.
They were the first casualties, really, especially municipal services, water, electricity, sewage treatment. Why? Because their costs. Things like imported chemicals for water purification or spare parts for power stations were often priced in foreign currency, which was soaring.
But they were billing customers in Zimbabwe dollars, which were becoming worthless.
Exactly. Their revenue collapsed in real terms while their costs exploded. Plus, skilled engineers and technicians fled the country because their salaries were worthless. So the systems just broke down.
No running water in cities. No reliable electricity. What did that mean day to day?
The book paints a bleak picture. Taking a lukewarm bath because there's no running water to refill or heat it. Toilets you can't flush. People drilling boreholes in their gardens if they could afford it. Or buying water from unsafe sources on the black market, leading to cholera outbreaks.
And electricity?
Constant blackouts. Widespread theft of copper cables and transformers for scrap metal just made it worse. People relied on generators if they could get fuel, or they resorted to cutting down trees for firewood, even in urban areas. Massive deforestation.
And this collapse spread to social services too. Hospitals, schools.
Absolutely. Hospitals became dangerous places. Imagine power cuts during surgery. Basic medicines unavailable. Schools fell into disrepair. Teachers left. Local health insurance companies went bankrupt because the premiums they collected became worthless before they could pay claims.
Just a total system failure. But the authors point out two exceptions, right? Two parts of the state that didn't collapse.
And this is critical for understanding Phase 3. Amidst all this chaos, the police and the military were kept functional. Their salaries were prioritized, they got resources.
Which strongly suggests their purpose wasn't serving the public, but serving the regime.
Precisely. It shows that the state prioritized the instruments of control over the instruments of public service, which brings us directly to phase 3, hyperinflation as a tool of political control.
So it wasn't just an accident. The state realized inflation could be used.
They realized it was a powerful tool for plunder and control. The authors quote Keynes, "By a continuing process of inflation, government can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Printing money gave the regime unlimited spending power, disconnected from any need to tax or be accountable."
They could reward allies, fund the security forces, manipulate markets. But didn't inflation also destroy their own tax revenue?
It did, bizarrely enough. Think about annual income tax. By the time the tax was assessed and finally paid, maybe months later, the real value of that payment had been inflated away to almost nothing.
So the government couldn't even fund itself through normal taxes anymore.
Which forced them to rely even more heavily on the printing press and on direct, overt confiscation, like imposing levies on the foreign currency people tried desperately to keep in bank accounts.
And this weaponization was really clear in the banking sector, wasn't it? The Reserve Bank became something else entirely.
It became an engine of privilege. Favored banks essentially got direct lines of credit from the Reserve Bank, funded by newly printed money. It was like a credit card with no limit and no expectation of repayment.
And what did these banks do with this free money?
They didn't lend it out for productive purposes. They immediately used it to speculate, buying up shares on the stock exchange, buying property, buying scarce foreign currency. They were protecting their own balance sheets and profiting hugely from the very inflation the Reserve Bank was creating, while everyone else was being wiped out.
The ASPF loan seemed like the most blatant example of this rigging.
Absolutely. The ASPF program, supposedly aid to surplus producers and exporters, was Reserve Bank-funded loans forced onto commercial banks. But these loans went overwhelmingly to the politically connected elite, not genuine exporters.
And they used these loans how?
They'd get a huge loan in Zimbabwe dollars, instantly convert it into US dollars, or buy assets like shares or property, and then watch as hyperinflation made the Zimbabwe dollar loan effectively disappear. It was a direct, state-sponsored mechanism to transfer wealth from the masses to the ruling elite. Pure looting, facilitated by the printing press.
So as the official money died, the state had to use more force to make people use it, right? Moving from just economic manipulation to outright coercion.
That's the inevitable endgame. When the money dies, trust dies. And when trust dies, the state has to rely on force. They passed increasingly draconian laws trying to force people to accept the worthless Zimbabwe dollar, imposing crazy price controls that guaranteed shortages in black markets.
And enforcing those controls required constant surveillance.
Total surveillance. Every transaction became suspect. The state needed to monitor everything to prop up the fiction of the currency's value.
Which connects to this idea of liquidity obfuscation, the authors mention, using confusing jargon.
Yes, it's a deliberate tactic, using complex terms like quantitative easing, or all the fancy names for bailout programs we saw in the US and Europe after 2008. The goal is to make the simple act of printing money sound sophisticated and obscure.
To confuse the public so they can't object.
Exactly. If people don't understand the language, they feel unqualified to criticize. They just accept the intellectual authority of the officials. It's a way to avoid accountability for fundamentally dishonest actions.
And the street-level enforcement of this control came from agencies like NECI, the National Economic Conduct Inspectorate.
These agencies were the regime's enforcers. They weren't investigating real crimes. They were monitoring transactions, harassing businesses, basically acting as extortion rackets for the state and for themselves. They could threaten anyone with jail time because, under the chaotic laws and price controls, everyone engaging in basic survival was technically breaking some rule.
The book tells a story about an executive interrogated by NCI.
A chilling story. These dark-suited, shady characters, as the book calls them, didn't want justice. They threw him in jail over a weekend on fabricated charges. Why? To pressure him into handing over his company's scarce foreign currency reserves?
So the law became just another tool for theft?
Purely. It wasn't about right and wrong anymore. It was about power, coercion, and extracting wealth. That's what happens when the monetary foundation collapses.
Which brings us to the endgame, Phase 4, the currency reset. Gorge Moment 6, the final death throes of the Zimbabwe dollar. How bad did it get right at the end, late 2008?
It became utterly farcical, almost darkly comic if it wasn't so tragic. The Reserve Bank kept lopping zeros off the currency. They did 3 major redenominations, removing a total of 25 zeros over the whole period.
25 zeros.
Yeah. But even that didn't work. Prices rose so fast, calculators couldn't display the numbers. The government actually started printing expiry dates on banknotes, trying to force people to spend them within weeks before they became worthless.
Like milk cartons.
Pretty much. Trade just seized up. You couldn't conduct business.
But eventually the government just gave up.
They had no choice. Between November 2008 and February 2009, they effectively surrendered. They officially allowed people to use foreign currencies, the US dollar, the South African rand, the British pound for transactions. The Zimbabwe dollar instantly became worthless paper. The printing presses finally stopped because no one would accept the output anymore.
Stabilization must have been a huge relief, but adopting the US dollar wasn't painless, was it? There was an immediate shock.
A very painful shock for some. The whole economy had to reset based on a real, stable currency. Think about exporters who had been thriving, getting paid in valuable US dollars, but paying their local workers and suppliers in worthless Zim dollars.
Their whole business model evaporated overnight.
Instantly. Suddenly, their local costs were in hard US dollars too. Many collapsed. And adding insult to injury, the Reserve Bank often seized whatever foreign currency reserves these companies still had during the transition to dollarization.
And did the mentality of inflation disappear quickly? That expectation of constant price rises?
Not entirely. That was one of the weirdest hangovers. The book gives this incredible example. After dollarization, a company got sued by a trade union. And the arbitrators people who had lived through years of this madness actually sided with the union, demanding a 500% inflation increase on wages, payable in stable US dollars.
They couldn't mentally grasp that inflation was over.
Their brains were still wired for hyperinflation. It shows how deep the psychological scars were.
But despite that hangover, the core message comes through loud and clear. Stabilization happened almost overnight, not because of some complicated plan or new wealth,
but simply because of restored honesty. The government was forced to stop printing money, forced to accept a stable monetary standard, and confidence, the bedrock of any economy, returned remarkably quickly once the lie stopped.
which underscored the book's central point. Sound money starts with moral discipline, not just economic tinkering.
Absolutely. Stop the printing, stop the lying, and the foundation for recovery appears.
Okay, so that brings us to the final phase, phase 5, the universal warning. Zimbabwe's story, while extreme, isn't unique in history, is it?
Not at all. The authors draw clear parallels with Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Similar situation. Huge government debts, reparations in Germany's case, a political decision to print rather than tax or cut spending, erosion of property rights, and ultimately societal collapse leading to political extremism. The pattern repeats.
And this is where the book really turns its gaze towards, well, us. Major modern economies, especially the US, written back in 2014. What were the warning signs they highlighted then?
They pointed to the sheer scale of debt. At that time, U.S. government and household debt was already around $30 trillion. But the really terrifying number was the estimate for unfunded liabilities, things like Social Security and Medicare promises, which they put at $100 trillion or potentially even more.
Numbers that dwarf even the debts that triggered the collapses in Zimbabwe or Weimar. And what was the policy response, especially after 2008?
More debt and money printing. The Federal Reserve's quantitative easing, QE, had already pumped $3.5 trillion into the system by 2014. Central banks worldwide were doing the same. The authors, citing McKinsey, noted the world added something like $57 trillion in new debt between 2007 and 2014, trying to fix a debt crisis.
Trying to fix debt with more debt.
Which, as they argue, just makes the whole system more fragile and potentially sets the stage for a much larger global Black Friday moment down the line.
And this comes back to their fundamental argument about sound money being moral architecture. Why is destroying money ultimately destroying freedom?
Because it starts with a lie. The government insists it can create value out of nothing, just by printing. When people realize that's false, trust in the government, trust in institutions, trust in each other, it all evaporates.
And when trust goes?
The state has to step in with force. You need coercion to replace voluntary cooperation. You need total surveillance like NCI to enforce the use of worthless money and control economic activity. The collapse of currency inevitably leads to the rise of the police state because freedom can't survive without a foundation of trust, and trust can't survive without honest money.
Which is exactly what the American founders understood from the Continental dollar experience.
Precisely. They saw it happen. They knew that giving the government the power to print money at will was giving it the power to confiscate wealth silently, to reward its friends, punish its enemies, and ultimately to control the population.
That gold and silver clause wasn't just about economics. It was about limiting government power to protect liberty.
It was a deliberate constraint, designed to prevent exactly the scenario that played out in Zimbabwe. They knew that freedom rests on a foundation of sound, honest money, not on government promises, backed only by the printing press. Zimbabwe's tragedy is just the founders' warning playing out in the modern world.
So, when money destroys nations isn't just a history of Zimbabwe. It's a timeless lesson, really. A blueprint showing how nations that ignore the link between currency, truth, and morality inevitably follow that cycle.
Debt leads to debasement. Debasement leads to economic collapse. Collapse leads to tyranny. It's a recurring pattern.
The book forces you to confront the scale of the promises made, especially in Western economies. They included a stark thought experiment based on those 2014 U.S. debt figures.
Yeah, it's sobering, they asked. If you took every single dollar the U.S. federal government collects in taxes and diverted all of it, no spending on military, roads, schools, healthcare, anything, just used it only to pay off the official national debt and the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, how long would it take?
And the answer, based on those 2014 numbers?
About 3 decades.
30 years. With zero government spending on anything else.
It really puts the scale of the fiscal challenge into perspective. It forces you to ask what services would have to disappear, what happens to society in that scenario, and critically, what politically convenient but ultimately destructive policies, like maybe, just maybe, more money printing or even overt wealth confiscation might governments resort to in the future to avoid facing that reality. That's the uncomfortable question Zimbabwe leaves us with. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.